Over the fields of southern England, contrails curled like ghosts. To the people below, the Battle of Britain looked almost beautiful, white lines crossing a blue summer sky. But to the men of 609 Squadron, strapped into Spitfires with sweaty palms and pounding hearts, those lines meant life or death. Hi, my name is Sam, and welcome to Eyes Shut History. Before we fly into battle, if you like these stories and feel like you have learned something from these videos, then please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps me write more stories for you guys. Now, sit back, relax, and let your eyes shut to history. It was the summer of 1940, and Britain stood alone. France had fallen, the Low Countries were under German control, and the Wehrmacht's tanks had rolled all the way to the Channel. Across the narrow strip of water, the Nazi war machine massed for invasion. Hitler believed Britain would sue for peace. When they didn't, he turned to his Luftwaffe to hammer the island into submission. Before soldiers could land, the skies had to be won. For most Britons, the threat was both terrifying and oddly ordinary. Life went on. Children went to school, farmers cut their hay, families dug vegetable patches in back gardens. And yet, everyone looked up at the sky more often than they used to. The low growl of aircraft engines could mean safety a lone RAF patrol, or destruction a formation of German bombers. Air raid sirens wailed across towns and cities, and people hurried underground to shelters, clutching gas masks, wondering if the next raid would be theirs. For the men of the Royal Air Force, the summer was measured not in days or weeks, but in sorties. Squadrons scrambled at a moment's notice, pilots sprinting across grass airstrips, pulling on helmets as mechanics shouted and waved. Spitfire and Hurricane engines roared to life, tails lifted, wheels left the ground, and within minutes they were climbing into the blue, contrails trailing behind them like chalk lines across a school slate. 609 Squadron was one of these units. Officially, they were the West Riding of Yorkshire Squadron, formed before the war and trained in peacetime skies. By 1940, they were flying Spitfires out of southern bases, thrown into the very heart of the battle. Their roster was a mix of young British volunteers and an increasing number of foreign pilots, Poles, who had fled their occupied homeland, Belgians, New Zealanders, South Africans. They came from different languages, different cultures, but in the cockpit all spoke the same tongue. The clipped urgency of radio calls, the instinctive grammar of survival. Life on the ground at an RAF fighter station was a strange blend of boredom and terror. Hours could pass in quiet routine. Pilots lying on deck chairs in the sun, reading newspapers, smoking cigarettes, drinking tea out of chipped mugs. Some wrote letters home, careful not to mention too much. Others napped with helmets beside them, ready to be woken by the alarm. The waiting was the hardest part, the knowledge that any minute could shift from quiet to chaos. The alarm bell changed everything. Pilots dropped mugs, newspapers, even half-finished meals and sprinted across the grass. Ground crews shouted, swung propellers, fueled and armed the planes in frantic rhythm. Engines coughed, roared, and the Spitfires surged down the runway, one after another, lifting into the air in tight formation. In those moments, 609 Squadron went from sleepy idleness to deadly purpose in less than 3 minutes. To civilians watching from hedgerows or gardens, it looked almost elegant. Silver planes soaring upward, sunlight catching on wings, contrails curling high above. But inside the cockpits, the pilots felt none of the elegance. They felt the sweat on their palms, the straps biting into their shoulders, the thrum of the Merlin engine through the stick. They smelled oil and fuel, heard the clipped chatter of controllers guiding them toward incoming raids, and squinted into the sunlight for the first glimpse of black specks on the horizon. The Luftwaffe came in force, waves of Heinkel and Dornier bombers, escorted by Messerschmitt 109 fighters, swept across the Channel. Their target, airfields, radar stations, London itself. To face them, the RAF scrambled again and again, outnumbered, exhausted, and under constant pressure. 609 Squadron was in the thick of it. Losses came quickly. A pilot who had been laughing in the mess one evening might be gone the next morning, his Spitfire trailing smoke into a field or the channel. Ground crews patched bullet holes, scraped blood from cockpits, and sent the planes back up again. The squadron became a revolving door. New faces arriving fresh from training, veterans disappearing into the sky, never to return. And yet, through it all, there was humor. Pilots teased each other over missed landings, swapped pranks in the mess, invented rituals for luck. Some carried rabbit's feet or coins. Others relied on routine, always putting on the same glove first, always tapping the fuselage before climbing in. Superstition was a shield against fear, and fear was constant. 609 Squadron was not alone. Across southern England, dozens of squadrons fought the same battle, day after day, sortie after sortie. But within each unit, the struggle felt personal. It was about the man in the next bunk, the mechanic who kept your engine running, the wingman whose plane you tried to cover. The wider war might be about nations and strategy, but in the cockpit of a Spitfire, it was about survival, second by second. The summer of 1940 was long, hot, and relentless. To those on the ground, the dogfights overhead looked like distant games of tag, white trails looping and crossing in the sky. To those in the air, they were life-or-death duels at 300 miles per hour, where one mistake could mean fire, smoke, and a plunge into the fields below. And through it all, Britain endured. The pilots of 609 Squadron, tired, hungry, frightened but unbroken, took off again and again, meeting the enemy over the channel, over the fields, over the cities. They were not many, but they were enough. Becoming a fighter pilot in 1940 was not a glamorous process. The posters made it look noble. Young men with perfect hair in crisp uniforms, gazing confidently into the sky. The reality was sweat, nerves, and the constant knowledge that even training could kill you. Most recruits were barely out of school. Some had been university students, others farmhands or clerks. Many had never even sat in an aeroplane before the war. They signed up in a flush of patriotism or out of sheer stubborn refusal to see Britain fall. A few admitted later that they just wanted to fly. Whatever their reasons, they arrived at training stations in droves, only to discover that flying a Spitfire was not something you eased into gently. The process began on the ground. Classroom sessions on aerodynamics, engines, navigation. Blackboards filled with diagrams of lift and drag, instructors pacing and lecturing about propellers and instruments. Recruits doodled in notebooks or stared blankly, wondering how much of it they'd actually remember once they were strapped into a cockpit with their heart hammering. Then came the Tiger Moths, small, fragile biplanes used for initial training. They looked quaint, almost like toys compared to the sleek Spitfires waiting down the line. But for many, climbing into a Tiger Moth was terrifying. The cockpit was open, the controls unfamiliar, the ground suddenly very far away. The first solo flight was a milestone, one that left pilots alternately elated and sick with fear. Crashes were common, wheels caught in rough ground, wings clipped fences, engines failed at the wrong moment. Some men never made it past training. Their lives ended before they ever faced the enemy. Instructors were blunt. If you can't handle this, you won't handle combat. The sky, even in training, was unforgiving. Those who survived the basics moved on to more advanced trainers, Harvards, with closed cockpits and heavier controls, closer in field to the real thing. Here, recruits practiced aerobatics, tight turns, dives, and gunnery. Shooting at canvas targets towed behind another plane was exhilarating at first, then sobering when accuracy proved harder than expected. Few could imagine trying the same while being shot at in return. The pace was brutal. In peacetime, pilots might have had months, even years, to hone their skills. In 1940, with invasion looming, training was rushed. Some men had barely a dozen hours in a Spitfire before being posted to an operational squadron. One recalled later, "I was still learning where all the dials were when I first met a Messerschmitt." For 609 Squadron, this meant a constant influx of half-trained replacements. Fresh-faced boys arrived at the airfield, wide-eyed at the sight of the sleek Spitfires, nervous about meeting veterans who had already been blooded in combat. They were given bunks, brief tours, and then thrown into the rhythm of scrambles and sorties. There was no gentle introduction. Survival itself was the lesson. The mix of nationalities made training even more eclectic. Poles arrived after fleeing their occupied homeland, desperate for revenge. They were already skilled pilots, many with combat experience, but their English was often limited to a few phrases. Controllers shouted instructions. Polish pilots responded with curt acknowledgements or bursts of Polish swearing. Misunderstandings were frequent, but in the air, skill spoke louder than language. Belgians and Frenchmen joined too, survivors of their country's defeats. They brought bitterness, pride, and determination to prove themselves. New Zealanders and South Africans added their own accents and humor, joking about the English weather, swapping tales of long voyages to reach the war. 609 Squadron became a patchwork of voices, united by the singular goal of keeping the Luftwaffe out of British skies. Ground school never fully prepared them for the realities of combat flying. Pilots learned quickly that a Spitfire was not just an aeroplane, but a living machine, responsive, beautiful, but also temperamental. The Merlin engine roared like a beast when coaxed properly, but faltered if mishandled. Controls were light but unforgiving. Stall too low and there was no time to recover. Push the engine too far and it would seize in the worst possible moment. Veterans passed on hard-earned wisdom to newcomers. Don't chase a Hun too low. He'll drag you into flak. Keep your eyes moving or you'll never see him coming. Never, ever fly straight for more than 10 seconds. These were rules learned in blood, repeated in the mess with casual tones that masked their deadly seriousness. Life in training was not all lectures and flying. There were nights in pubs, pints of beer, songs sung too loudly. There were dances with local girls, awkward introductions, fleeting romances that ended as quickly as they began. There were hours spent polishing boots, ironing uniforms, and grumbling about food in the mess hall. The ordinary rubbed shoulders with the extraordinary. But always the specter of what awaited hung over them. Training accidents were reminders enough. An empty bunk in the hut, a letter posted home by an instructor instead of the pilot himself, a funeral attended by recruits who knew their turn might come next. The line between training and combat was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. When a recruit finally joined 609 Squadron, the transition was jarring. He might have just weeks of training behind him, and suddenly he was on a grass airfield, watching Spitfires roar overhead, listening to veterans swap stories of dogfights and near misses. The mess was filled with laughter and bravado, but also with silence, pilots staring into cups of tea, thinking of friends who hadn't returned. The newcomers were watched closely. Could they handle the strain? Would they freeze in combat, or would they fit seamlessly into the squadron's rhythm? Some proved themselves quickly, flying with skill and daring. Others faltered, struggling with the speed, the noise, the chaos of battle. The learning curve was steep, and the margin for error was razor thin. Still, camaraderie grew. Veterans took rookies under their wing. Ground crews treated them with the same weary affection as the others. And soon, they were part of the family. They joked, drank, and argued like brothers. and like brothers, they mourned when one fell. By the time the great raids of August and September swept across the Channel, 609 Squadron was a blend of experience and youth, of British and foreign voices, of pilots who had trained for years and others who had barely learned the controls. Together, they would face the greatest test any Air Force had yet known. The first scramble always came faster than expected. For the new pilots in 609 Squadron, there was barely time to settle into their bunks before the alarm bell clanged across the station. Men dropped mugs, chairs skidded, voices shouted, and boots thudded across the grass. Ground crew were already at work, propellers swinging, fuel lines detaching, armorers slamming panels shut. Pilots sprinted, helmets half-fastened, goggles bouncing around their necks. Engines coughed, sputtered, then roared as Merlins came alive in unison. The noise was deafening, rattling windows and sending gulls scattering from nearby fields. Pilots clambered into cockpits, fumbling with straps, adjusting throttles, flicking switches with hands that shook from adrenaline. The airfield smelled of petrol, hot oil, and scorched grass. Then, one by one, the Spitfires leapt forward, tail up, wheels off, climbing fast. Within moments, the squadron was airborne, wings flashing in the summer sun. From the ground, civilians pointed and shaded their eyes, watching as the contrails curled higher, white scratches against blue. To them, it looked effortless. To the men in the cockpits, it was a blur of noise and tension. Controllers' voices crackled in their ears. Raid approaching from the south. Angels 15, Vector 090. The language of interception was clipped, almost abstract. Numbers and headings stood in for fear. Pilots adjusted courses, climbing toward the Channel, eyes straining at the horizon. And then they saw them. At first, just black dots against the haze. Then more and more, until the sky seemed filled with specks. German bombers in tight formation, flanked by Messerschmitt 109s, sunlight glinting on canopies. The sight punched the breath out of new pilots. This wasn't a training flight or a lecture about tactics. This was war. The order came. Tally-ho. Throttle forward, nose down, Spitfires screamed into the dive. The gap between friend and foe closed in seconds. Bombers loomed large, their gun turrets swiveling, tracers spitting into the sky. German fighters dropped to intercept, sharp shapes diving head on. The sky erupted in chaos. A dogfight was nothing like the books or posters. It was speed, noise, confusion. Pilots craned necks, scanning constantly, knowing the enemy could appear from any angle. 1 second, you had a target in your sights. The next, you were the target. Radio chatter mixed with bursts of gunfire, engines roaring at the edge of control. A rookie in 609 fired his guns for the first time. The 8.303 Brownings rattling the wings. Tracers streaked into a Heinkel, sparks flashing on the fuselage. The bomber shuddered, smoke streaming, then kept flying, its gunners hammering back. The rookie swore, banked hard, nearly blacked out as the G-force pressed him into his seat. He'd hit, but not enough. Elsewhere, veterans moved with practiced precision. They knew the rhythm: dive, fire, brake, climb, check your tail, dive again. They called warnings, shouted curses, laughed even, as if defiance itself could keep them alive. For the new men, it was overwhelming. The first losses came quickly. A Spitfire trailed smoke, spiraled down, hit the ground in a ball of flame. No parachute. A bunk would be empty that night. Another bailed out, his parachute blossoming white against the sky, drifting slowly down. Whether he would survive capture or land in friendly fields was anyone's guess. For those still fighting, there was no time to mourn. A Messerschmitt flashed past, guns sparking. A rookie pulled hard, the wings groaning, bullets slashing holes through the tail. He lived by inches. Later, on the ground, he would find his aircraft stitched with holes, one round lodged inches from the fuel tank. The dogfights stretched across the channel and over fields dotted with villages. Farmers paused in their work to watch, shading their eyes, hearing the distant rattle of guns. Children pointed at contrails, twisting like ribbons. To them, it looked like a deadly ballet. They didn't see the sweat, the terror, the stink of cordite filling cockpits. When the squadron finally broke away, fuel running low, the survivors limped home. Engines coughed, gauges trembled, pilots exhaled for the first time in an hour. They landed one by one, tires skidding on grass, props ticking as throttles cut. Mechanics swarmed, counting bullet holes, pulling open cowlings, muttering about how much patching would be needed before the next scramble. And then came the roll call. Pilots climbed from cockpits, legs shaking, lighting cigarettes with trembling hands. They gathered in the mess, sweating through uniforms, eyes darting to the door. Someone counted. Someone else asked. Then the silence came. A name uncalled. A bunk that would stay empty. For rookies, the first loss was a shock that cut deeper than the dogfight itself. They had trained together, laughed together, and now gone. The veterans nodded quietly. They had seen it before. They would see it again. Ground crews mourned too. They had patched those planes, fueled them, even named them. They had waved the pilots off and waited for their return. When one didn't come back, the absence hit like a hammer. They drank that night as heavily as the pilots did. Yet amid the grief, there was pride. 609 Squadron had survived its first real clash, claimed victories, proved itself. The new men had tasted combat and lived to tell the tale. They would be sent up again tomorrow and the next day until the war decided otherwise. The first encounters in the sky had taught them what training never could, that combat was chaos, survival was luck as much as skill, and every sortie was a gamble. They also learned something else, that they were no longer recruits. They were now, in every sense, fighter pilots. If the dogfights were chaos, the hours between them were strangely ordinary. At an RAF station, life was ruled by the scramble bell, a sound that could change a lazy afternoon into a fight for survival in seconds. But when the bell was silent, the pilots of 609 Squadron lived in a kind of limbo, caught between boredom and dread. The airfield itself was a patch of grass cut into the English countryside, ringed by hedges and dotted with dispersal huts. Spitfires sat in pairs, parked at angles, their wings glinting in the sun. Mechanics swarmed over them constantly, topping up fuel, patching bullet holes with sheets of metal, fitting fresh tires, cleaning guns. The smell of hot oil and petrol clung to everything, mixed with the damp earth of the fields. Pilots lounged in deck chairs outside the huts, goggles hanging loose, jackets half unzipped. Newspapers fluttered in the breeze, tea cooled in mugs, cigarettes burned down to ash. Some played cards, others dozed with helmets at their feet. The sun beat down, and for a few moments it felt almost like a summer holiday. Almost. But under the calm, nerves always prickled. Everyone knew the bell could ring at any second. Men laughed a little too loudly, joked a little too sharply. Some smoked constantly, lighting one cigarette from the stub of another. Others fiddled with lighters, watches, pens. Anything to keep their hands busy. In the mess hall, the food was basic. Powdered eggs, stewed vegetables, meat, if supplies allowed. Pilots wolfed it down when they could, knowing a scramble might come before the plate was finished. More than one meal ended up abandoned on a table, half eaten, while its owner was already strapped into a cockpit. Tea was the one constant. Gallons of it were brewed, poured into chipped mugs, gulped down hot or cold. Pilots joked that the RAF ran on two things, Merlin engines and tea. Ground crews swore by it too, sipping between long hours with spanners and fuel lines. Letters home were another ritual. Men wrote to mothers, wives, girlfriends, careful to keep their words light. I'm safe. Don't worry. The weather's fine. The food's dreadful. They didn't write about the empty bunks or the smell of burning oil in the sky. Those truths stayed in the mess, never on paper. Humor was essential. The squadron kept spirits up with pranks, swapping boots, hiding helmets, sketching crude cartoons on the notice board. Nicknames abounded, some affectionate, some less so. Pilots teased each other mercilessly about bad landings, missed shots, or loud snoring. Laughter in the mess echoed louder than it needed to, as if to drown out the silence that followed. Superstition thrived, too. Some men carried coins, medals, or lucky charms into the cockpit. Others had routines, always putting the left glove on first, always tapping the fuselage before climbing in. One Polish pilot in 609 refused to fly unless he'd smoked exactly half a cigarette before takeoff. If the bell rang and he hadn't finished, he'd stand there puffing furiously while mechanics shouted at him to move. Sleep came fitfully. Pilots collapsed into bunks at odd hours, boots sometimes still on. Uniforms reeking of oil and sweat. Dreams were restless, filled with engine noise and tracer fire. Some woke shouting, others lay wide-eyed in the dark, listening to distant thuds of bombs falling on London. Exhaustion was constant, but it was never deep enough to block out the war. The ground crews had their own rhythm. They worked endlessly, often in silence, patching holes, refueling tanks, loading ammunition. They rarely slept, grabbing minutes where they could on benches or in hangars. When pilots stumbled back from sorties, the ground crews met them with relief and banter, then set immediately to work. They didn't fly, but they knew the cost as well as anyone. Every bullet hole was a reminder of how close death had come. Civilians lived with the battle in their own way. Families in villages watched the skies like theater, pointing at contrails twisting above. Farmers paused their plowing to listen to the distant rattle of guns. Children collected shrapnel from fields after raids, treating it like treasure. In cities, especially London, the experience was harsher. Air raid sirens blared nightly. Families huddled in shelters. Bombs thudded into streets. Fires lit the sky. For them, the Battle of Britain wasn't a distant spectacle. It was survival. Sometimes, pilots on leave wandered into nearby towns and found themselves treated like heroes. Strangers bought them drinks. Women slipped them addresses. Children asked for autographs. The pilots were embarrassed more often than not. They knew how thin the line between survival and death was. How many of their heroes never made it back? Between sorties, reflection crept in. Pilots stared at the sky, cigarettes dangling, thinking of friends lost, wondering if they'd be next. Some admitted later that they lived hour to hour, never planning beyond the next scramble. Others clung to normality, polishing boots, shining buttons, writing letters as if routine itself could hold chaos at bay. Yet even in these quiet hours, 609 Squadron remained ready. Boots by bunks, helmets within reach, goggles polished, because everyone knew the next bell could ring at any moment. And when it did, the tea would be dropped, the cards scattered, and the calm shattered. Life on the ground was not glamorous. It was tea, mud, sweat, waiting, and nerves stretched thin. But it was the glue that held the squadron together, the fragile rhythm that made the chaos survivable. Between sorties, 609 Squadron laughed, grumbled, smoked, wrote, and remembered. And then, when the bell rang, they ran. By late summer 1940, the Battle of Britain had reached its breaking point. The Luftwaffe shifted strategy, no longer just probing raids or scattered attacks. Now they came in force. Hundreds of bombers at a time, escorted by sleek Messerschmitts. Their target was clear. Destroy the RAF, wipe out its airfields, silence its radar, and break the back of Britain's defenses before autumn. Rains made invasion impossible. For 609 Squadron, it meant the days blurred into each other. Scramble after scramble, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single afternoon. Pilots barely had time to land, refuel, and gulp down a mug of tea before the bell rang again. Exhaustion dug into their bones. They flew on muscle memory, on instinct, on sheer stubborn will. The sky was never empty. Contrails crisscrossed overhead like scars. Dogfights scattered across the Blue Dome from the Channel to the Thames. Pilots described it as a vast, chaotic dance. Formations breaking apart, aircraft twisting and diving, flashes of fire marking another life ended. Sometimes Spitfires and Messerschmitts streaked so close that pilots swore they could see the whites of their opponents' eyes. 609 Squadron earned its reputation here. On some days, they claimed more enemy aircraft destroyed than any other squadron, their tally climbing higher and higher. The newspapers printed numbers, calling them heroes. But in the mess, the pilots knew the cost. For every bomber brought down, there was a Spitfire that didn't return. Victories were toasted with beer in the evening, but there were always empty chairs at the table. The raids grew larger. Bombers filled the sky in great box formations, bristling with defensive guns. To attack meant diving headlong into streams of tracer fire, hoping to line up long enough for a burst before breaking away. Many Spitfires came back peppered with holes, fuselages patched like patchwork quilts. Ground crews worked through the night, hands raw, wrenches clanging to make them fly again by dawn. On the ground, airfields became targets themselves. 609 squadrons scrambled from grass strips that were cratered daily by bombs, hangars shredded by shrapnel, fuel dumps set ablaze. Mechanics dived into slit trenches as bombs fell, then scrambled out again to push planes onto undamaged ground. Pilots took off through smoke and debris, skimming burning wreckage as they clawed into the sky. The pace was relentless. Pilots grew gaunt, eyes shadowed with fatigue. Some fell asleep fully dressed, boots still on, only to be shaken awake by the alarm. They joked about it, of course. Jokes about drinking more tea than petrol, about yawning mid-dogfight. Laughter covered the cracks, but everyone felt them. Civilian life carried on beneath the battle. In London, the Blitz had begun. Families huddled in shelters while bombs thundered overhead, fires lighting the night sky. In villages, farmers looked up from fields to see the sky streaked with smoke trails, distant parachutes drifting down. Children cheered when a German bomber fell in flames, then fell silent when a Spitfire followed it down. Churchill's words spread through newspapers and radios. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The phrase stuck, and the pilots of 609 Squadron became the few. They were embarrassed, mostly. Some laughed it off. Others muttered that the Prime Minister had made them sound like gods. But they weren't gods. They were tired, scared, hungry young men doing their best not to die. The height of the battle brought stories that lived on for decades. One pilot landed his Spitfire riddled with holes, the canopy shattered, blood dripping down his sleeve, and walked calmly into the mess for a cigarette before fainting. Another bailed out over the channel, clinging to a dinghy for hours before a fishing boat hauled him aboard. A third swore he'd seen a Messerschmitt pilot grin at him before the two spiraled apart in a dive. The Poles in the squadron were particularly fierce. Having lost their own homeland, they fought with a ferocity that shocked even the veterans. Their English was patchy, their manners blunt, but their skill in the air was undeniable. Some of 609's highest kill tallies belonged to Polish pilots, their names hard for controllers to pronounce, but easy for comrades to respect. By September, the battle reached its climax. On the 15th, the Luftwaffe launched one of its largest raids, hundreds of aircraft streaming across the Channel, aiming for London. Every squadron was thrown into the air. 609 joined the fray, diving into a sky so crowded with contrails it looked like a spider's web. Pilots described it later as the day the tide turned. The Luftwaffe lost heavily, bombers falling in flames across fields and rivers. For the first time, the pilots felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they could hold out, but hope did not bring back the dead. Each sortie still cost lives. Each night, the squadron mess was quieter. Empty bunks grew in number. Letters arrived with black-edged envelopes. Survivors grew quieter too, their laughter thinner, their eyes more hollow. They had become veterans in a matter of weeks, hardened by exhaustion and grief. And yet, they flew on. Not for glory, not for Churchill's speeches, but for each other. For the man in the next bunk, the mechanic who waved them off, the wingman who covered their tail. Brotherhood was the only shield against the scale of it all. By the end of September, the Luftwaffe began to pull back. Losses had been too heavy. Invasion postponed. Britain was bruised, London scarred, but the skies were still defended. The Battle of Britain had reached its height, and the RAF had held. 609 Squadron, battered but unbroken, looked around at the wreckage of their planes, the gaps in their ranks, and realized they had survived the storm. But survival came at a price that would stay with them long after the contrails faded. Victory numbers filled the newspapers, but inside the squadron huts, victory looked different. It looked like empty chairs in the mess, boots tucked neatly under bunks that no one would wear again, flight logs with names that ended in silence. The Battle of Britain was won in the air, yes, but for 609 Squadron, it was also lost in dozens of small personal ways, each time a man failed to return. Pilots learned not to dwell too much. After every sortie, after every roll call, there was a moment of silence, a quick glance at the door, a name unspoken. Then someone would clear his throat, light a cigarette, and conversation would stumble back into motion. It wasn't coldness, it was survival. If they let grief settle too heavily, they wouldn't be able to fly again tomorrow. Still, grief had its ways of seeping through. A letter left half-written on a desk. A joke repeated in the mess, only to trail off when everyone remembered who usually laughed the loudest. A pint ordered at the pub and left untouched at the corner of the table. The ground crews felt it too. They patched planes for pilots they'd grown fond of, swapped jokes during long nights in the hangar, and then watched those planes take off, never to return. One mechanic recalled wiping blood from a cockpit with a rag, swallowing hard as he worked, knowing his pilot wasn't coming back. They weren't flying the sorties, but they carried the same weight. Superstition deepened as losses mounted. Pilots became fiercely protective of their rituals. One refused to shave before a sortie, convinced smooth skin brought bad luck. Another always wore the same scarf, threadbare and oil-stained, as if the fabric itself kept him alive. When a man broke his own routine, whether through hurry or chance, the others noticed, uneasy, watching him more closely as he climbed into his cockpit. The bond between the men tightened with every week. It was brotherhood born of necessity, but also of genuine affection. They teased each other mercilessly, but it was the teasing of brothers. They shared cigarettes, swapped stories, ribbed each other about dances and girlfriends. And in the air, they trusted each other completely. Covering a wingman's tail wasn't just a tactic. It was an act of loyalty, of love even, though they'd never have used the word. Foreign pilots brought their own brand of brotherhood. The Poles were fierce, blunt, and unstoppable. Their English was patchy, but they communicated through laughter, handshakes, and the universal language of flying. The Belgians brought warmth and gallows humor. The New Zealanders a casual bravery that steadied nerves. Together, the squadron became a patchwork family, stitched from different countries, but bound by the same fight. Loss made them closer. Every man who fell seemed to drive the survivors into tighter circles. Arms linked more firmly, jokes shared more tenderly. They began to fly not for Britain, not for Churchill's speeches, but for each other. A pilot later said, "I wasn't fighting the Germans. I was fighting for the man in the next bunk survivor's guilt crept in too." Some pilots confessed decades later that they asked themselves, "Why him, not me?" They remembered standing on the grass, watching parachutes blossom, counting them, realizing there weren't enough. They remembered sitting in the mess, waiting for footsteps that never came. They remembered telling families in letters that their sons, brothers, husbands had been brave. Their bravery and survival rarely matched. And yet, they endured. Humor stayed alive, sometimes darker than before, but still vital. A pilot limped into the mess after a rough landing, hair singed, uniform scorched, and declared he'd never had a smoother flight. Laughter roared, loud and shaky, because it felt good to laugh when the alternative was to cry. Evenings in the pub became rituals of memory and release. Glasses clinked for absent friends. Songs were sung badly, pints spilled, darts thrown. Civilians in the pub sometimes stared at the pilots, so young, so loud, so alive, and wondered how many of them would still be there in a week. Through it all, the brotherhood deepened. Pilots walked side by side to dispersal huts, boots sinking in the grass, conversations half-whispered. They smoked on the airfield, staring at the sky, the silence between them heavy but comfortable. They leaned on each other when the weight grew too much. By the autumn, 609 Squadron had been whittled down. Faces had changed, names replaced, but the core remained, tired, hardened, unbreakable. They had survived the height of the battle, but survival had come at a price none of them could quite put into words. Years later, when the survivors gathered, they spoke less of kills and sorties and more of each other. The laughs in the mess, the jokes on the grass, the rituals and pranks and quiet talks. The battle was won in the skies, but its true story lived in the brotherhood forged in those months of fear and loss. Because in the end, the pilots of 609 Squadron weren't just the few. They were each other's few. A small band of young men who faced the storm together and who carried one another through it. By October 1940, the skies had changed. The great German formations still came, but not as often, not as large. The Luftwaffe had lost too many planes, too many men for too little gain. Hitler postponed his invasion. The Channel, once bristling with barges and soldiers, returned to quiet waters. Britain had not fallen. For the men of 609 Squadron, the end of the battle was not marked by a trumpet or a cheer. It came slowly, like the fading of a storm. The scrambles became less frantic, the skies less crowded. The airfield, once a revolving door of takeoffs and landings, fell into longer stretches of silence. Relief came first. Pilots who had lived hour to hour suddenly realized they might live another week. Mechanics could sleep more than a handful of hours without being woken by bomb blasts. Civilians looked up at clear skies and dared to breathe again. But relief was not joy. The losses were too fresh, the bunks too empty. The mess hall, once filled with laughter and banter, was quieter. Conversations turned inward, voices lowered, eyes drifting toward the door out of habit. Victory felt heavy, because victory had cost so much. Newspapers printed pictures of smiling pilots, heads tilted confidently, cigarettes between fingers. The few, Churchill had called them. The public saw heroes. The pilots saw themselves as survivors, lucky, tired, still young but aged beyond their years. One muttered in the mess, "The few," more like the leftovers. Laughter followed, thin but real. Life outside the airfield carried on. Civilians recognized the faces of pilots in pubs, bought them drinks, thanked them awkwardly. Some of the younger pilots enjoyed the attention. Dances, romances, fleeting kisses stolen before another posting. Others felt embarrassed, shifting uncomfortably under praise. They knew too many names carved into memorial boards to feel heroic. 609 Squadron continued to fly after the battle, of course. The war wasn't over, far from it. They would see action again and again in different skies, with different faces in their cockpits. The Battle of Britain was just the beginning. But something in that summer of 1940 never left them. Years later, survivors described it not as a story of glory, but of endurance. The exhaustion, the fear, the brotherhood, the constant presence of death and the small moments of life that made it bearable. A mug of tea, a prank in the mess, the sight of a friend's plane landing safely beside yours. For Britain, the legacy was clear. The RAF had held. The invasion never came. The island remained free, a base from which the Allies would one day return to Europe. The Battle of Britain became legend, etched into history as the moment when the tide of war first turned. For 609 Squadron, the legacy was more personal. They remembered each other. They remembered the laughter, the rituals, the losses. They remembered the sound of Merlin engines roaring to life at dawn, the smell of oil on the grass, the sight of contrails curling across the sky. When they gathered in reunions decades later, the stories flowed easily, not of kills or sorties, but of each other, of the man who insisted on finishing half a cigarette before takeoff, of the one who sang loudly in the mess, out of tune, but with heart, of the mechanic who worked through the night without complaint, patching a plane that saved a life the next morning. And when the laughter faded, there was silence. A silence filled with the memory of empty bunks, of names unspoken, of faces frozen in youth. Because for every survivor, there were many who never lived to grow old, who never saw peace, who never stepped out of the cockpit again. 609 Squadron became part of a legend, but legends can feel distant. What mattered most to those who lived it was the brotherhood that bound them together. They were the few, yes, but they were also just a handful of young men in the summer of 1940, flying into the sky because someone had to, and surviving because of each other. The Battle of Britain ended with no victory parade, no fireworks, just the slow return of quiet skies over southern England, and the knowledge that Britain still stood. And sometimes, on clear days, villagers looked up and thought they saw contrails curling high above. To them, it was beautiful. To the men of 609 Squadron, it would always be the shape of survival. Thanks for listening, and good night to you all.